This is Kanzenshuu, the podcast, episode 440 for the week of April 22nd, 2018. Hello, welcome to Kanzenshuu,
the podcast,
an extension of the all-encompassing Dragon Boy podcast. Wait, website. See, I said the wrong thing and I screwed up. What's the name of the website?
Kanzenshuu.
We cover anything and everything Dragon Boy, all in hopes of enlightening and a little bit of entertaining.
Good job, Mike.
Yeah, I'm not doing so hot today. My name is Mike, Fujito EX, but also just Mike. Joining me, it is the man himself, Julian. Hello.
Yes, thank you. You don't need to clap for me.
I am excited. We have been, you and I, actually, it's been like old times. It's just you and I plugging away at sections, and like we're just springing it on people. The other day, I messaged Heath. I'm like, hey, look what we've been doing. It's like, oh my God, where'd this come from? I love this kind of stuff.
Isn't he the administrator?
Well, no, him and I, we co-own, we co-administrate.
Oh, fair enough. You think you notice when stuff pops up on the
when
site,
new pages? Yeah. Well, I mean, when they're private pages, it doesn't automatically show up in the log, so you have to go digging for it. So it's how we're able to hide things from each other. We are kicking off a 2-part podcast series. You're listening to the first part right here. I don't know when the second part will be. It'll probably be in the very near future. We are digging back pre-Dragon Ball. Now, we've done stuff like this before. We've talked about things like Dr. Slump, how that influenced and transformed into Dragon Ball. I am shocked in the, 12 years that we've been doing this podcast and looking through the guides and the interviews on the website. We've barely scratched the surface of talking about the prototypes that became Dragon Ball, separate from Dr. Slump. And most specifically, we're talking about Dragon Boy and the Adventure of Tong Pu. We have really not ever gone in any kind of depth with it. And I happened to be rereading them and said, we should, God, there's nothing on the website about these other than some offhand comments and some interviews. And well, I decided to build out a section and recruited Julian in to help do the final proofreading and fact checking on things. And as we're looking at it, we're going, this is also a podcast topic. Obviously we'll document the stuff on the website, but I think there are cool opinions we can get into as well. So the first part here, we're going to talk a little bit about Dr. Slump again. Way back, I say way back, it was only 6 years ago on episode 288 of the podcast. Jake and I we called it a Dr. Slump primer. We talked about some of the characters in Dr. Slump that appeared in Dragon Ball itself, and that was in service of some other stuff that was going on. So we're not going to necessarily talk about the characters, Julian. We'll talk about some of these story ideas and the concepts and some of the things that Toriyama's kind of got percolating there that'll show up a little later on. And then we're going to talk Dragon Boy in depth. We'll save, like I said, Tong Pu and Dragon Ball drafts for the next time here on the episode. That is our podcast. I am very excited for it. I've been enjoying my work on this section so much. So the way it's going to work is we'll do the first part of the podcast here. In the very near future, you'll get the second part of the podcast series. And then when that episode goes up, all of the manga guide pages will go up to accompany that.
All right.
That is our plan here. So without further ado, Mike and Julian chatting up Dragon Boy. Let's get into it. So again, we talked a little bit about Dr. Slump in the past on the primer episode. I don't necessarily want to talk about characters. If you don't know who Arale is, I feel like you have bigger issues at play here. Maybe you need to go back to volume 1 of Dr. Slump and start there. Let's dive forward in time a little bit into Dr. Slump. Toriyama introduced tournaments in Dr. Slump.
Yes. So he has a number of tournament type episodes. As the story goes on, Toriyama gets into doing more and more multi-part stories in Dr. Slump. And some of it involves his love of cars and racing. So you get these Penguin Grand Prix racing things. But eventually we also have some actual fighting tournaments. And that happens to be the Sekaiichi Tsui no Dare da Taikai, which is the Who's the Strongest in the World tournament.
That sounds very familiar.
Yep. It does.
What's so fascinating here is that, he's starting to do tournaments in longer arcs. The longest is like 5 chapters in Dr. Slump?
Yeah, like 5 or 6 chapters, yeah.
They're not long. It's fascinating to me that he's starting to do tournaments here, and that's not something that he's going to do at the very beginning of Dragon Ball. That's kind of like a reactionary thing when we get to Dragon Ball.
Right. And it's very much, he talks about it in some interviews, is the reason he started doing longer stories is he got strapped for ideas. And coming up with a punchline for every single comic for him was very exhausting. So he thought, hey, I can have it go on for more, so I don't have to think up one every single week.
Right.
But then into Dragon Ball, he decided to just go in the whole hog and actually have a continuing story that just carried on from week to week.
So tournaments are a big thing. I feel like one of the most overlooked people, you got to go back and you got to read Dr. Slump. There's an evil scientist with a series of numbered robots, and he himself is one of them.
Yep.
Actually, twice by mistake.
Yep, because the author screwed up the naming and a fan points it out, and so he just goes ahead and changes numbering. So Dr. Mashirito is an evil mad scientist who wants to take over the world using his robots. He also happens to be a caricature of the author's editor at the time, Kazuhiko Torishima, who went on to become the biggest of the bigwigs at Shueisha. But at this time, he was just an editor in Weekly Shonen Jump. And so yeah, he basically managed to sneak it in by sending in the manuscript at the last minute so it couldn't be changed. And then they stuck with it because the fans liked it.
Yeah, it's a good idea. I mean, it's a great way to introduce more characters. We get a regular character out of it, too.
Yeah, that's true. And he's the closest thing that the series really has to an antagonist. But yeah, it starts out with just simple robots, definitely inspired by 1960s anime, which the author would have watched as a kid. Or read as manga. And then as it goes on, he creates this sentient equivalent to Arare, who becomes a member of the main cast. You get Obochaman, or Caramel Man number 5.
I can't remember the number. I know.
Right around there. And his name was actually chosen as part of a contest, I believe, by fans. And once his name was set, it stuck, and he became an integral part of the cast.
Yeah.
And in the future, glimpsed later in the series, he and Arare are basically robot married with a robot baby.
I love it.
Don't ask me how that works.
Well,
it just does.
I guess we can talk about that in Dragon. Well, no, they're actual real robots.
Yep, they are robots.
Real robots. And then I feel like I always want to mention this because it's just such a cool parallel. One of the final villains in Dr. Slump is a Majin.
Yeah, and it's interesting in that I don't think Toriyama planned this at all.
No.
But there's a series of stories, well, it's 4 or 5 parts. Basically, the princess of this faraway kingdom, vaguely Middle Eastern-ish, runs away because another kingdom is trying to take it over, and she escapes to Penguin Village, where she happens to be a dead ringer for Akane, one of Arare's friends.
Yeah, I guess associates. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the main group. And so Akane gets kidnapped by the bad guy, and stuff happens. Tsukutsun, who's Akane's more or less boyfriend, flies into a rage, and as the bad guy's sort of trump card, he brings out a teapot, which reveals a genie. And there's biting and fighting, and the world gets destroyed. Don't worry, it comes right back. Yeah, there's a lot of parallels there. Yeah. And the funny thing is, I don't think the author even thought about it when he was doing the Boo arc. Just something that he happens to have somewhere in there that got pulled out more than once.
Right. I feel like we're going to come back to that over and over, where is he necessarily kind of pulling from himself intentionally, or are these just ideas that he has and he will reuse? And we'll see that directly in some of these prototypes we're going to talk about, where if it's not just the same situation, it may even be the exact same framing within a panel.
Right.
And for Toriyama specifically, I'm so curious if it's intentional or if it's just he's just on another plane of existence and the things just happen to be drawn that way, and even he doesn't know where they come from sometimes.
And it's worth pointing out, that he has intentionally reused things in the past. He was very fond of photocopying and reusing panels.
Right. He'll call out himself on it when he does it, though.
Well, there's the time in the 22nd Tenkaichi Budokai where mysteriously Lunch and Bulma and Puar are back in the audience after they left with Yamcha.
Right.
And there's several parts where you see an overhead view of God's palace where a young Goku is clearly standing there in spite of the fact that he is now an adult and not in the scene.
Right.
Because they reused that panel from way back in the Piccolo arc.
Right, without doing anything to it. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and there's a point where he calls it out specifically in the Boo arc with the fusion dance in particular. But yeah, so he is not immune to doing that, and plenty of Jump authors basically reuse their concepts from one-shots to do the as a basically a pilot of their main series. In fact, an interesting case is with Eiichiro Oda in two separate one-shots, both called Romance Dawn, which is also the title of the first chapter of One Piece. So the first version is basically the flashback scenes play out much like the first chapter, where you have Shanks and he loses his arm. I hope I'm not spoiling anybody here. But then the second version introduces this wrinkle where instead of Shanks, we actually have Luffy's grandfather play this role as a sort of stern parental figure. And people thought that was just a bit of misdirection because the series itself would not be following too far behind. But lo and behold, years upon years later, the character was reintroduced into the main series, and pretty much with no with no changes to his personality. So that was pretty funny. But
and we're going to see that exact same kind of thing go on here. So let's leave Slump behind a little bit. We'll touch on it here and there with some of these points. But we're still in the time period of Dr. Slump. I mean, you may think of, okay, Toriyama went from Dr. Slump to doing his test prototype series to then Dragon Ball. That's not actually how it happened. You look at the one-shots Toriyama had been doing for a while. I mean, he was, I don't want to say prolific, but kind of prolific for a while in the 80s there. He was cranking out the one-shots, whether they were part of a contest or just him just doing a one-shot for something. He seemed like he always had something going on. Then when we get to Dragon Ball, he kind of stops doing all that.
Yeah, and it seems like it was part of a broader trend that at first they had the Jump authors doing a lot of side stuff, and then that sort of worked its way down.
So let's talk about where we are in the history of Toriyama here. When Dragon Boy debuts in Fresh Jump, which we'll talk about momentarily, we are in June 1983. And at this point, Toriyama's at just about chapter 176 in Dr. Slump. That's in the 1983 number 29 issue of Weekly Shonen Jump. At this point, he's going to be wrapping up the following August, so a little more than a year from this point, with chapter 236. So he's still got another year in Dr. Slump, but at this point, he's already starting looking ahead to what he wants to do next. So before we talk about Dragon Boy itself, Julian, I guess kind of set the stage. What are the conversations Toriyama's having with Torishima right now?
So Toriyama at this point is kind of sick and tired of doing Dr. Slump. He's frustrated with coming up with more comedic ideas, and while he's maybe not showing it apart from doing more continuing stories in the manga, he's like ready to do something else and he wants to end it. But the only thing is, Torishima doesn't want to let him end it because after all, Dr. Slump is very popular. But he hears from elsewhere that Toriyama happens to be a big fan of kung fu movies. So he says, well, why don't you try doing like a kung fu one-shot? We'll see how it turns out. And Toriyama was initially against this because, after all, the things you like and the things that you can draw are not necessarily one and the same.
Right, and it's more work. So
right?
He doesn't want to do that.
On top of his serialization.
Right.
But he ends up going with it because, after all, it's his editor, and basically the editor's decision is more or less final. And it actually got a decent response.
So that brings us to Dragon Boy. Now, this debuts, it's in 2 issues of what was Fresh Jump?
So Fresh Jump was an magazine they introduced back in, I think, 1982 to sort of give a venue for like new authors and basically fresh talent, hence the name, to show off one-shots and new stories, and eventually it gains some bigger names, and I think Toriyama's former assistant, Hisashi Tanaka, eventually had a series that went on in there. But Toriyama himself was no stranger to the magazine. He was in, if not the first issue, then like one of the first 2 issues with Pink. In 1982. So going on, it seemed to be ramping up the publication because it started out bi-monthly, but actually in between the publication of the 2 Dragon Boy chapters, it went monthly.
I feel like history just continues to repeat itself. An equivalent today would be Saikyo Jump, which started as a quarterly publication and then moved to monthly and then went to bi-monthly. Like they're always introducing, reintroducing, rebranding magazines. There was a monthly Shonen Jump for a while. Some of the Nekomajin was published in there. So this was just another of Shueisha's magazines at the time that served some kind of purpose.
So there's this constant cycle of things, and there's seasonal bonus issues keep getting rebranded. I forget what it is now. It's like Jump Next, or I don't know. That might have been the previous version.
All right, so let's just get into Dragon Boy now. Again, we are talking about the August 1983 issue of Fresh Jump. This is June 23rd, 1983. Toriyama debuts the first chapter of Dragon Boy. So we're going to do this kind of old school manga review of awesomeness style, where I'll give you a rundown of the chapter. They're not long. And then we'll talk about them a little bit, and we'll talk about the legacy here. So we get into Dragon Boy with a young boy. This is Tang Tong. We'll talk about all the names and pronunciations, and Julian can correct everything I say later on. He's training alone out in the mountains when his master arrives on a flying cloud. The master throws a bunch of kunai, which Tang Tong is mostly able to dodge. He throws several in response, eager to learn more, and the master manages to swipe away all but one, which lands squarely in his forehead. Anyway, it turns out the master has a job for him. He is to accompany the princess of the Flower Country, who ran away 2 years ago to escape war, and he needs to bring her back to her homeland now that there is peace. So Tang Tong is excited to finally see a girl and pokes at her chest to confirm their soft bodies. The princess, however, is not so sure about this boy. Now, the master hands Tang Tong a dragon jewel. If he is in trouble, he is to place it on the ground, infuse it with his ki, and a dragon will appear. Finally, the master advises him not to show his back to anyone. So Tang Tong and the princess take off on a motorbike. The princess takes over driving at one point, but she can't handle the speed. Now, when they hit some mountains, they are forced to get off and walk the rest of the way. This is quite a significant journey for them. The princess eventually wants to take a bath, so they stop at a river. It is here that he truly sees a girl for the first time. This is where he's starting to piece it all together in his head, like, oh, boys, girls, got it. The princess asks if he has a family, but he says that he is a monster that was abandoned when he was small, and that his master is the one who always takes care of him. As they continue their journey, the princess decides she needs water. The two stop at a temple, and as they pull some water up from a well, Tang Tong feels some kind of ki emanating from it. A large water demon is pulled up and attacks them. He offers to let Tang Tong go if he hands over the princess, but he refuses and jump kicks the demon in the face, but it barely even reacts to this. Tang Tong is able to dodge the demon's attacks, but he's not going to be able to hurt him with such a hard body. He takes out the dragon jewel and fires his ki at it, only for a tiny, completely useless little dragon to poof out of it. Cursing his master, Tang Tong decides what he must do, even if the princess hates him for it. He takes off his shirt, revealing dragon wings. He flies into the sky and dive bombs the demon right in the face, soundly knocking him out. As Tang Tong flies off carrying the princess, she sternly asks why he did not say he had wings earlier. They could have been flying this whole time. The Flower Country is still very, very far away. And that is the first chapter of Dragon Boy. We will move on to the second and final chapter of Dragon Boy. Now, Julian, explain one more time. So this is the October 1983 issue. So this is in September. So we've moved from June to September. What has the magazine done in the meantime?
It's gone monthly.
It's gone from bi-monthly to monthly in the meantime.
Yes.
Got it.
And so now the post dated by a month rather than 2 months.
Got it.
Yep.
Now, when you look up the dates, it's the same thing like when we deal with V-Jump now, where it's 21st of the month, but it's 2 months ahead.
Yeah, it's a pain.
It's a pain in the butt. So, Chapter 2 of Dragon Boy. Tang Tong continues flying toward the Flower Kingdom, sleeping princess in tow. The two stop for a bite to eat. They are only a tenth of the way there, and Tang Tong needs to get his strength back with a little grub. He brought 2 rice balls that his master provided, but the princess is not interested. She wants soup instead. Behind the bushes, ears pop out. Tang Tong turns at the rustling sound and finds a polite young man who introduces himself as Ping Yao, who is on a journey of his own toward Mount Tinghao. Tang Tong asks where Ping Yao's bags are. After all, he is a traveler and should probably have something with him. No, some thieves stole it or something. Anyway, you have a rice ball. Can I have that to eat, please? I have not eaten in a day. The princess screams for Tang Tong to give up his rice ball, even though she never wanted to eat hers in the first place, but he already ate his, so the princess is forced to hand over hers anyway. Tang Tong thinks to himself that this Ping Yao has a demonic ki and must not be human. As soon as he gets the rice ball, he poofs back to his actual form, a sort of blobby, weird, floating cat circle thing. Tang Tong is angry over this trick and starts to walk over to beat him up, but Ping Yao turns into a rock to protect himself. Tang Tong smiles, points to a similar rock beside them, and proceeds to smash it to smithereens with a single punch. At this point, Ping Yao turns back to normal and runs away, apologizing for his actions. The princess asks Tang Tong why he didn't do more to punish him, but it was just a rice ball after all, and they have to get moving again anyway. The two next come across a giant bridge. The princess wants them to fly across, but she'll settle for being carried across. They notice a large castle in the distance when Ping Yao suddenly rushes in to warn them of impending doom. Ping Yao is actually 250 years old and tells them about a monster that took up residence here about 100 years ago and attacks anyone who tries to cross the bridge. Tang Tong is not worried and insists that he'll just beat up any bad guys that they come across. It's just then that the large monster rushes in and smacks Tang Tong over the head with a staff. As the princess pees her pants and Tang Tong continues to be assaulted, Ping Yao yells out that this is the machine soldier from Heiyun. Tang Tong notices how the machine appears to be rather damaged. For the last 100 years, it has probably been following its programming to protect the castle. He manages to get a few flips and attacks in, but nothing is getting through to the machine. So he instead tries to reason with it. The princess is not helping at all, interrupting to ask that he not spill the beans about her little accident in her pants down there. Distracted, Tang Tong gets knocked off the bridge. Here, Ping Yao panics, and as the machine raises its hands to attack the princess, it's at this point that Tang Tong bursts from the river, wings outstretched, and knocks the machine over. This doesn't seem to be enough, though. He's gonna have to keep fighting. A voice suddenly shouts for them to stop. A soldier has arrived, telling the machine that it has protected the castle well, but it can rest now. With a tear dropping from its eye, the machine thanks the soldier and shuts down. Finally safe, the soldier poofs back to reveal that it was Ping Yao. The princess, still completely oblivious to their situation, figures she can avoid embarrassment after ruining her clothes by having Ping Yao transform into a new set of clothes. While they manage to make it to the castle, Ping Yao suddenly transforms back to normal, though, leaving the princess completely naked. Like Ultraman, he can only transform for 3 minutes at a time. As Dragon Boy comes to a close in its second and final chapter, the Flower Country is still very, very far away. Julian, that is Dragon Boy. You read this, you listen to this description. It is undeniably Dragon Ball in its purest form here, isn't it?
Yes. So we don't have the conceit of the Dragon Balls themselves, but the idea of going on a journey, this boy acting as the makeshift bodyguard / chauffeur of the female character, who in many respects has the more selfish aspects of Bulma in her earlier years, and sometimes in her later years. And then you also have some of these characters that are very similar in idea to other characters that come out in Dragon Ball. The Water Demon has maybe some shades of the Bear Bandit that they meet in Dragon Ball. Mm-hmm. And of course, Ping Yao shares aspects of both Oolong and Puar.
Also, the Old Master, you throw everyone side by side here. It's crazy. This one actually comes first. The Master here, the Old Master with the staff on a flying cloud. Shortly after this, we're going to get God in Dr. Slump with a staff on his own kind of like spaceshipy kind of floating thing. Oh, no.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. Good enough.
And then we will get to the Turtle Hermit himself in Dragon Ball with the staff, and that can command a flying cloud that he himself cannot use anymore anyway.
Right.
But when you look at them side by side, it's a clear evolution of, all right, I'm going to take this design, I'm going to change it here, but then I'm going to take both elements and turn it into this character over here. And just some of the exact situations that we have. The kunai being in the forehead, it's like the exact same pose as we'll get after Chi-Chi throws her helmet at Kami-Sennin there. Everything about learning what girls are and the situations, as we get to Tongpu later, we'll have a bathtub situation that's a little closer to what Dragon Ball would be. But even here in Dragon Ball, it's a similar thing, just the bathing and trying to figure out what all the body parts are, all that kind of thing.
Oh boy.
Her hanging over the side of the cliff, it's very similar to Bulma herself getting, she's hanging off Noibo there in Dragon Ball. I mean, everything here, just like this Chinese-inspired locales going on a journey. Like you said, we've got the protagonist who's a bodyguard. He's got to accompany this girl. Master is there. They have something everything that they're specifically doing, like it is Dragon Ball, so distilled. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about the first chapter here. Maybe you can talk about some of the names here. So Ting Tong, if you read the furigana, traditionally in English language fandom, it was written out as Tanton. What's the name here?
So it's written in Chinese characters with an approximate Japanese pronunciation that's sort of going off of Chinese. So in Chinese, I guess you could say Tang is the word used for the Tang dynasty, and it is also, by extrapolation, also used to refer to China in general. And then Tong is literally boy or boy servant in even earlier meaning. So literally, it's basically just Tang boy or China boy. The setting is ersatz China, and he's a boy. So,
right.
Yeah.
I guess by extension there, we can talk about the title of the series itself. It's one of those things where it's written with furigana that is different from the normal reading, I guess you would have, of the kanji. What's the title here?
So literally, it's Kiryu Shonen, something like Riding Dragon Boy, or something to that effect.
Like chauffeur Dragon Boy?
Basically, I think that would be how I had interpreted it.
But the furigana tells you, no, pronounce this as Dragon Boy.
So it's one of those things that you often get in Japanese, where the pronunciation often tells you a specific way of reading it that's at odds with the normal way that you would pronounce the Chinese characters.
Well, let's go into some of the other characters. The master here, Goroshi-sama.
So Go is just like literally a way of showing respect. And so Goroshi-sama is like elder master. And it happens to be the same Roshi as we encounter in Muten Roshi, the master who is the god of martial arts, or just the venerable old master. Mm-hmm. So it's not a given name, it's a title, very much like for the Turtle Hermit himself.
We have a princess who doesn't have a name. She's just the princess of the flower country.
Yes. So she's Ka no Kuni no Hime-sama. So Ka no Kuni, literally the flower country, but the word for flower that they use is the same one that's normally used within China and also in constructions like chuka ryori, so Chinese food, to indicate China itself, because it's like the flower of culture compared to what China for a long time viewed as the barbarian countries around it.
Gotcha.
So basically a way of saying China without saying China.
So this is really Toriyama just consistently doubling down like, it's China. Get it? It's China.
Yep.
Right. So the only other character in the first chapter here is the water demon.
So he literally refers to himself as Suijaki, which is water demon.
So there are items here, two in particular. One I think is most notable because if you go by old scanlations, you would be led to believe this was in fact called a Dragon Ball. But that's not really what it's called.
Yes. So the pronunciation given by the furigana is Donpao, and it uses the Japanese simplified character for dragon along with the one for treasure, which I would translate as dragon jewel. And it is shaped like a ball, and it contains a dragon,
right.
So you can see why people would be confused.
And then the water demon has a weapon, but I know that it's just because there's not much to it, so I figure if there's anything in here, we should probably mention it. It's a pretty traditional Chinese polearm.
Yes, it's called a guantao, which is, it's a polearm. And it's got the little tassel on the blade, which is a traditional thing that they do.
Maybe the only other thing we can talk about with the first chapter that's kind of like a cited thing, Julian, you have Toriyama's comments from these particular issues.
So his issue from this copy, let me start again. His comment from this issue of Fresh Jump says the following. Star Wars を見た後、感激のあまり Star Wars プラモを山ほど買ってしまったぞ. Which means after I saw Star Wars, I was so deeply moved that I ended up buying a mountain's worth of Star Wars model kits.
That sure sounds like Toriyama. Model stuff, buying it all.
Yep. And indeed, there's another magazine with like a look at his workroom around this time where he's wearing an Admiral Akbar mask. Anyway, but he is referring specifically to Return of the Jedi, which came out in July of 1983. Now, this might sound strange since the chapter itself came out in June 1983, but he mentions in another issue of Weekly Shonen Jump that he actually saw a special sneak preview, which is why he got to see it early. Now, the other thing to note about this movie is that its title was actually Revenge of the Jedi in Japan, much as the working title of the movie was in English, and it wasn't called Return of the Jedi until the DVD release in 2004. which is relatively recently.
2004 does feel like yesterday.
Only a year before we started the podcast.
Yeah. All right.
Good times.
So let's move on to chapter 2 a little bit. Some of the other connections and references, much more obvious that he's going to be pulling from here. Ping Yao in appearance is everything that Oolong is doing. And then when he transforms back, it's Puar pretty much as is, just a little more blobby.
Pretty much. But on the other hand, some of his attitude and especially the limitations on his powers are more in the way of Oolong, especially the way he's introduced, where he disguises himself as something else to try and trick the main characters.
Right, right.
But we should note, however, that the character of Oolong is also based on a character from Journey to the West. So he's actually pulling from that for both of these. It's just that the Journey to the West reference is more obvious in Dragon Ball itself.
Right. In Journey to the West, I mean, part of their powers are transformations. So, like, sometimes he's pulling from source material and sometimes he's pulling from himself and sometimes both at the same time. Ping Yao's name.
Yes. So it's two Chinese characters, the first one being a simplified form, but literally the meaning is something like apple demon or apple ghoul.
It's kind of like shaped like an apple. Is that what you think it is?
Maybe, although it's kind of hard to tell. Maybe he just
a blob.
Like the ring to it. Yeah, he's just a blob.
I really like the idea of introducing himself like, hi, my name is Demon. Like, oh, okay.
Okay, that's not super obvious.
And he's going to some mountain which may or may not exist.
Yes. So again, it uses simplified Chinese characters, but it's written with furigana that indicate a pronunciation of Qinghao, or in Japanese, which would be Tinghao, which literally would be with the word mountain, and with it would be like Mount sounds good. My
reading there, and again, this is like 3 languages removed, is that saying, oh yeah, sure, that sounds like a good name for a mountain. Is that it, or is there a more literal meaning to it?
I've really no idea. Maybe he wants to go there because it sounds good.
Because it sounds good. Okay, fair enough.
Who knows? But that's what it was named.
So, Heiyun, where are we here?
So it's written with 2 characters with the Japanese approximation of Ha-yun. In Chinese, Ha-yun would mean something like river transport. It's the country of water is how it's glossed in Japanese. So basically, I'm assuming they made their fortunes by transporting things by water.
That makes sense. The most important character here is the robot. I think in the span of this one chapter, I feel like we get a really good arc to this unfortunate robot. You feel bad for the robot who's been protecting this castle, this bridge for 100 years. It's programming. Everyone is gone and no one has been able to tell him the war is over. There's nothing to protect anymore.
Which I feel like is also maybe pulled from an old Star Trek episode with similar things, like the robots are the protector of the planet, but the people that they were intended to protect are all gone.
Yeah, I feel like I've seen this a million times in various sci-fi things.
But yeah, it's kind of sad, and but people probably may not get wrapped up into it because they're too busy going, hey, it's the pirate robot.
Right. So we have to talk about the design. This is something that we see a million times. We see it here. We're going to see it in Tongpu. We're going to see it a couple times in Dragon Ball. And he's basically drawing the xenomorph species from Alien.
Yep. And it's something that he definitely likes because it reappears over and over again. Of course, you see it in Dragon Ball, not only with the pirate robot, with Frieza's 3rd form.
I mean, the pirate robot's the most obvious one because it's another robot with that same head design.
Yes, but he definitely uses it more than once in Dr. Slump. I think even he draws himself as a xenomorph.
That's great.
At one point. That's just Toriyama for you.
And then the other, and this one's actually named for what it is, kind of real life, real other media reference, Ultraman.
Yes. So Ultraman, being a cultural icon in Japan, first broadcasting in the 1960s and being a part of Toriyama's childhood and many other childhoods since it just keeps getting reinvented, is referenced here in that Ping Yao can only transform for 3 minutes. And if that sounds familiar, it's because also Oolong can only transform for 5 minutes.
Right.
Which is a different amount of time, but it's interesting that he pulled it from there. And Ultraman is something that gets repeatedly referenced in Dr. Slump especially, but it even gets a few sly references in Dragon Ball.
Oh, yeah?
There's what we like to call Ultra Fish, which is in like the 7th or 8th chapter of Dragon Ball. they're boating down the river, and there's a fish that pops up with the face of Ultraman, and it goes schwatch.
In terms of Dr. Slump, I mean, the most obvious thing I can think of, it's relatively early in the series. Was it like chapter 22? Raleigh?
Yeah.
She's having, what is the contest she's having? Is it like they're trying to scare each other?
It's something, I haven't read this in a while. The story of Dombe, who is having like this thing with Arale where they're both trying to surprise each other.
Get some kind of reaction, yeah.
But at this point, she shows up dressed as Ultraman going, schwatch. And he's like, what are you talking about? Look, the sun's already setting.
Ultraman is one of those things that Toriyama is aware of and isn't afraid to just name by name in whatever he's doing. Julian, again, like we had his author comment from chapter 1, we have his author comment from chapter 2. This one is very brief and very to the point and says everything we need to know about what he's doing here.
And he says, 奥さんが山ほどの中国の資料を持っているのですごく参考になってます which is, my wife has a mountain of materials on China, which is really coming in handy.
Sure is.
Yes. So his wife is Yoshimi, whose maiden name is Kato. But her pen name is Nachi Mikami. She was a modestly popular shoujo cartoonist back when she got married to Toriyama in 1982. And she, quote-unquote, retired then to become basically a homemaker and also Toriyama's sometime assistant. And definitely her interest in China seems to have rubbed up quite a bit on Toriyama over time. I mean, they even visited China in 1984.
That brings Dragon Boy to a close, just those 2 chapters. So we have a couple other things we can talk about, but let's talk about it as a story. I mean, we mentioned what's going to be reused in Dragon Ball, but independent from that, Dragon Ball doesn't exist at this point. It's so hard, but let's try to put ourselves in the shoes of someone in Japan in 1983, probably familiar with Dr. Slump, checking out some of Toriyama's one-shots over the years. We get to this. Do you look at this and do you see a future here? What do you think?
Well, I feel like with the open-ended story, this would be something that I'd be kind of curious to see where it goes, and as a fan I might even be slightly disappointed that he abandons this and goes with Dragon Ball instead. Just because I don't know where that's going. It's like, but you just did this other thing that I wanted to see continued.
Right. I mean, we get the 2 chapters. I mean, for all you know, you're sitting around waiting for chapter 3, and instead you over in Weekly Shonen Jump you're going to get Tong Pu, and you're like, wait a minute, I just read basically this kind of story, and then shortly after that you're going to get Dragon Ball. I mean, it's like I've read the same thing from you 3 times in a row. Can you just pick a story and just tell the story, please? Right.
And that's something that actually happens a lot. I mean, I referenced Eiichiro Oda, but that's far from unique.
No, of course.
I mean, you have pilot stories for things like Devil Lady. Devil Lady, is that correct? No, I'm thinking of something else. Not Devil Lady. What's the name of Katsura's work?
Devil Man Lady? Shadow Lady.
No, that's Shadow Lady. There we go. I think those are all separate series. Shadow Lady is the one that I mean. Shadow Lady, there was a series in the early 90s actually drawn by the same artist for things like Death Note and Hikaru no Go, but under his previous pen name. Takeshi Obata? Does that sound right?
Yep.
But he wrote about an old guy who was a cyborg, and that was introduced as a one-shot and then expanded upon as a series. And you get the same thing with even things like up to the present day, like My Hero Academia. Started out with a very different story, but a very similar main character who has no special powers, but who happens to be an adult as a salaryman.
Right.
Instead of an aspiring hero. But so you see this over and over again. They use these other magazines as sort of ways for them to spitball ideas for new things. And they'll basically see what sticks. Whatever, this got a decent response. Maybe I'll try developing this further into an actual series.
It's interesting because it's a public spitballing. It's very different from, all right, come up with a story for me and pitch it to me and I'll see if I like it. And maybe we'll make it. But this is, no, we're going to publish it and we'll see what kind of reaction it gets.
So it's very much a different process from a lot of these things, but it comes up again and again with these side magazines.
Yeah.
That it's a time-honored practice for Shueisha.
What do you think about the artwork in the 2 chapters of Dragon Boy? It's very much a Dr. Slump era. I feel like Toriyama, every year or 2, you can say, yes, that is 1983 Toriyama. Yes, that is 1989 Toriyama. It feels like it, but I feel like he's definitely showing where he's going to be going in the future. There's a lot of good gag reactions scenes, which obviously he's got a lot of familiarity with. In terms of action shots, I mean, there's a couple. There's like he's punching the rocks to show off. That's pretty neat. That's got a good flow to it. Him flying in to hit off the bridge, I mean, that's pretty good too. That's a good angle to it where you really feel the reaction of him flying through and kind of tripping the robot there.
Yes, and Toriyama mentions, especially early on, that while he enjoyed the compositions, he always felt that they were a bit stiff, more like illustrations than
I can see that.
action.
Yeah.
So as he goes on, I feel like he gets much better in the framing or the composition of his art to get across a sense of action, and he's really starting to dial it in.
Right.
It takes him until a little bit into Dragon Ball, I think, for him to really get it to click, but he's getting closer, and especially in 1983, he takes on Takashi Matsuyama as his assistant, who starts doing things like backgrounds. So the background art is also starting to resemble something like early Dragon Ball.
Yeah.
Which I think makes it go a long way towards starting to feel like what we get later on. But his art style is still definitely evolving. I'd say late 1983 to 1984 is fairly similar. So we start to get really more similar with Tongpu versus this. But it's getting closer.
There's one frame in particular. It's in the first chapter. It's when they hop on that hover bike thing. It's a really weird framing. It feels like he's turning it to like get going in a different direction. Just the way that his head is tilted and the way he's turning it, something about that doesn't feel quite right to me. And that's the kind of thing that Toriyama will be an expert at in a few years' time, like being able to show you. Toriyama's anatomy never makes sense, but it always looks right. And here it doesn't look quite right yet.
But he's definitely improving all the time. And I think especially while he professes to being constantly tired and going days without sleep, somewhere along the line, he's really just, by the simple fact of having to do it, he's really getting good.
Yeah, it's a great opportunity for him. As much as he probably doesn't want to be doing the extra work right now, you know, us in retrospect, we know where he's going to go, and I think it's very helpful for him to have had this opportunity. Let's talk about Dragon Boy. Where else has it appeared? Dragon Boy has been re-released quite a few times, and I would say it's readily available these days if you just know which particular thing to go buy. So originally it was in Monthly Jump.
Monthly Fresh Jump. Well, even then, the original one was not monthly yet. But it was in Fresh Jump.
It was in Fresh Jump. So I guess it's just easy to say Fresh Jump. It was in Fresh Jump. You're probably not going to get those issues. Good luck tracking that down. Equally difficult to track down. Its first republication would be in Birdland Press, which was Toriyama's official fan club newsletter of the time. It was reprinted in there, along with many other things.
That indeed. And it's interesting. Sometimes it got broken up into parts, and because we don't have the actual issues, because they're very rare, and when they do show up, they're price of my children, and I don't want to sell them. Where was I? So we're in the process of confirming specific issues and things like that. But the next few might be a little bit easier to track down.
Right. So as you go through time, they get easier to pick up. So the next one would be the Dragon Ball Adventure Special, the Boken Special. This was the first guidebook for the Dragon Ball series before the Kanzenshuu existed. This was November 1987. This is one of those things they call a MOOC. It's not quite a magazine. It's not quite a book. It's kind of in between. It's published under the same line of things. It doesn't sit in publication forever. It's kind of, you either got it or you didn't. An equivalent from the last couple of years would be that Super Start Guide for Dragon Ball Super. If you didn't get it when it first came out, that was kind of it. But they're out there and they're not prohibitively expensive. But if you have it or you're looking to get it, Dragon Boy and Tongpu are in there. And I think that's one of the first, like this is a Dragon Ball book, and we are explicitly labeling these as the precursors to Dragon Ball, like an official recognition of, this is where this came from.
It's probably the first time to, as well.
And they were recent at that point, though.
Right. This is 1987. This was before his second volume of his one-shot collection came out.
Right.
So they hadn't been publicly reprinted except for his fan club at this point. And it's kind of a way to get people into his previous things where maybe they've only seen Dr. Slump and Dragon Ball. And at this point, Dragon Ball's into the Piccolo arc. It's really, at this point, it's hit its stride. It's very popular. Previous to this point, it was really getting there in the Red Ribbon arc. The Red Ribbon arc is where it really became one of Jump's flagship titles, but really hit with the fans right around the time of the 24 first Tenkaichi Budokai.
Yeah, that's a good point. This would be the first kind of casual opportunity for people who didn't get Fresh Jump and weren't hardcore enough to be part of the fan club. They could just actually pick this up and read those prior works.
Right.
But then we get into super mainstream repackagings of things.
Things that are still available, and as long as you can get books that are published in Japan, then you can get these. So the first one is the second volume of Akira Toriyama's blank piece theater, or Toriyama Akira Marusaku Gekijo, which was released in 1988 and compiled a number of his early one-shots, both some that were a little bit obscure, like Today's Highlight Island was in a seasonal extra issue of Jump, which maybe not a lot of people saw. It's one of the ones that didn't get much of a good response.
Right.
But then there was Escape, which was a couple pages.
Escape is adorable.
One-off.
It's so short, but it's so cute.
Yep. And Pink, which was one of the early works to show up in Fresh Jump. And that one is cute. It also has a few echoes of his unpublished one-shots, which we're not getting into here because it's beyond the scope of this episode. But maybe we'll get a chance to talk about in the future.
In the second volume, you're getting those. You're getting some other stuff. Kinosuke-sama's in there, Mr. Ho. But in this second volume of Blank Piece Theater, you get Dragon Boy and you get Tongpu. Like everything you want, just all in one nice, easy collection.
Right. And it's still at the point where Toriyama is actually making volume-specific things to go in there. So there's little cartoons about his journey to becoming a cartoonist, which we recently translated and put on the site.
Yep.
So you've got that. And it's nice. It's nice to have if you can get it. I wish the digital version that they put out included the color pages with some of these.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I don't know if they still have them. Toriyama often, especially once his children were born, would give them to color on.
Right.
He was never too concerned about preserving his work.
Preserving his history, I know. Well, that's a good point to make, is that this tankobon version is available digitally. So if you have the ability to purchase digital products from Japan, go about it that way. And this version was reprinted in 2003 under the, was it Shonen Jump Remix? Shueisha Jump Remix?
Yes. So that's a convenience store exclusive line that re-releases popular things in a more economical format. So the paper's not great, but you get a decent chunk of his one-shots. It even included, I think, some of the early chapters of Neko Majin in there. In 3 volumes, but that later got its own standalone release as well in 2005. But those ones are rarer because, again, they were only in convenience stores and not released for very long, but they're slightly larger than the tankobon, and they also have some extra information in the pages. And then finally, we have the Emperor's Feast of Akira Toriyama, or Toriyama Akira Mankanzenseki, which it was in the first volume of 2. And this is bunko format, which is smaller physically, but it collects a number of Toriyama one-shots, including Lady Red, which was in one of the first 2 Super Jump issues. And because Super Jump was aimed at an older audience, he decided to engage in some quote-unquote adult material that's problematic.
It sure is a thing.
Yes. But anyway.
Right. So it's available there. The one thing I will point out here, like you said, it's smaller. I would say the paper quality is more approaching Kanzenban than it is tankobon. Like it feels a little nicer. The black is real nice on the page. The only issue here is that if you're looking to get Dragon Boy and Tongpu together, you're not going to get them in the same volume. They are in 2 separate volumes here.
Yeah, they don't bother going in chronological order.
No, it's just whatever fits. So that's where Dragon Boy is available. It's been referenced occasionally. Kanzenshuu, is it 2? The story guide touches on them. It's got early Dragon Ball works. So again, kind of like the Adventure Special, the Dragon Ball guidebooks are pointing these 2 things out, Dragon Boy and Tongpu, as yes, this is where Dragon Ball came from. These are important pieces of Dragon Ball's history, and we feel the same way. So that's why we're kind of talking about him here. Only other thing I kind of want to mention in our first part spectacular here is Dragon Boy has been referenced a few times in interviews over the years. Speaking of Kanzenshuu, one of the first times it came up was in the Shenlong Times that accompanied the second Kanzenshuu. This is Toriyama and Torishima touching on that that post-Dr. Slump time period. What were those works? And this is where they're kind of talking about what their spitball ideas are going to be. Do you want to play roles here? You get to be Toriyama. How about that?
Okay.
So I will be Kazuhiko Torishima, and Julian will be taking on the role of Akira Toriyama. While we were thinking of what to do for the next serialized work after Dr. Slump ended, Toriyama drew various one-shots for Weekly Jump and Monthly Fresh Jump.
I certainly did draw a lot of them. I had who knows how many painstaking meetings with Torishima-san.
But the reception wasn't very good.
Even though we had all those painstaking meetings.
Then, after Dr. Slump ended, there was a good response to Dragon Boy, which had been drawn without too many meetings beforehand.
And with that nice response, I felt, there's this track. It just might work out. And this time I had wanted a boy as the protagonist.
And then Dragon Ball gets referenced again in 2004 in the Dragon Ball Landmark interview. Again, Julian, I guess you can take on the role of Toriyama here. What does he have to say about it?
So I was incredibly happy that Dr. Slump became popular, but at any rate, weekly serialization is hard. And coming up with material got more and more difficult. I was always wondering how I'd be able to end it. And then I was told, you can end it as long as you start a new serial 3 months after it's ended. So while drawing the end of Slump, I drew a Kung Fu one-shot. Since I like Kung Fu movies, I firmed up the material for Dragon Ball from there. I think that by nature I'm more inclined towards gag manga, but solely because it meant I wouldn't have to make each chapter self-contained, I decided to do story manga instead.
And again, that's what we're talking about earlier with Dr. Slumper. It's like, I can't just do this self-contained. I have to come up with something. He just wants to do a continuous story. I think that works well for him. Dragon Ball gets referenced again many years later at this point in 2013. This was in an interview in Men's Nonno magazine. What magazine is this? We've got a few interviews from it on the site.
Yes, so Nonno itself is like the magazine for the young, fashionable woman in the workplace, and Men's Nonno is the equivalent, so for like the young single business professional.
Got it.
So he's reflecting on his past works around the time that Battle of Gods was doing the promotional thing for its home release. So he says, at the time, I loved Jackie Chan, and I'd watch videos of kung fu movies while I did my inking and such. Then Torishima-san came and said, in that case, draw a kung fu thing next. And I refused, because the things that I like and the things that I want to draw are different, so I don't want to. But in the end, he got his way. So to test things out, I drew a kung fu one-shot called Dragon Boy, and it was relatively popular, so I thought, well, looks like I just got to do it. At first, I intended on using the setting of Journey to the West as is, so I made the main character a monkey. Torishima told me that a monkey was no good, so I drew Goku next. Except maybe because he was a little plain, there was the opinion that I should give him a bit of a defining characteristic, so I added a tail.
And that gets into something we'll be talking about on the second part of our episode here on Dragon Ball Prototype Works. But then we have one more reference here, and this is from the Super History book in 2015. So again, we go from the earliest Dragon Ball guidebook to one of the most recent guidebooks. They're still talking about Dragon Boy. What does Toriyama say here?
He says, to be exact, it's rooted in this one-shot called Dragon Boy that I did before Dragon Ball started in serialization. I was stupid enough to mention to my editor, Torishima-san, how I constantly watched Jackie Chan's Drunken Master and whatnot, so he told me, if you like it so much, you should draw something like that. But liking something and wanting to draw it are two completely different things, so I didn't particularly want to do that.
He says the same thing over and over. He's quite consistent with his story here. And you said is, I like something. I don't want to draw that as what I'm doing for my job, because then I'm not going to like it anymore, because then I'm going to be then I have to do it. I've certainly put myself in this position, haven't I?
Pretty much.
So here we are, 1983. Dr. Slump is still going for a little over a year at this point before it reaches its end. Dragon Boy has come and gone. We have one more Dragon Ball prototype work. We'll be covering that on the next episode of our two-part Dragon Ball prototype extravaganza. What are your final thoughts on Dragon Boy itself, though? I mean, we kind of talked about it where it just kind of ends and it feels like it could continue. His artwork is evolving. What do you feel like its legacy is here?
Well, I think it gives us a clear indication of what Toriyama is capable of in terms of setting out something that is distinct from Dr. Slump and has its own kind of character. Especially the environments that we see are very typical of early Dragon Ball. And I think that must have been really encouraging for Torishima in particular, in thinking, we can go somewhere with this.
I mean, at this point, he has done plenty of other one-shots. Do you feel like there's any relation to any of the prior works here in Dragon Ball? Yeah, it feels very separate from Dr. Slump, but do you feel any DNA from anything prior, like Polaroid or Madmatic or Pink even?
Well, maybe slightly, but it's interesting to track the evolution of his one-shots. They increasingly have coherent plots as they go on.
Yeah.
And also he starts using less and less like just cheap punny jokes, although there are those as well.
Yeah.
And more situational humor. The characters being oblivious to things that are important to their survival or the plot.
I feel like I still see that. The things we see with the princess here in Dragon Boy, like I still see that in Jocko even. Jocko feels like the modern equivalent of his one-shots from there, and I guess that makes sense because it was its own self-contained story.
And I think very much he's refining his sense of humor because early on it's very much, oh, this is silly, I'll throw it in. And much later he thinks, well, this is funny because this character is acting this way, and this one isn't paying attention to that. And so it's a lot more involved in setting up a situation and making it pay off, where he doesn't do so much early on, but gets more and more proficient at as Dr. Slump goes on, and also in his one-shots. And I think you're seeing that refinement starting to pay off here.
So that is Dragon Boy. We have something else later that same year. It's crazy. Dragon Ball isn't going to exist for a while, but we have one more prototype next time. And I don't know if it'll be next week because I'm still trying to arrange a GT episode, but coming very soon in the near future, Julian, you and I, we will talk about The Adventure of Tong Pu, which is a single self-contained chapter one-shot. It's 45 pages, so it's a good length.
Yes.
In and of itself. We'll talk about that. We'll do all the same kind of thing. We'll do it manga review of awesomeness style. We'll give you a recap and we'll talk about the art and some of the parallels to later things. And then to truly wrap up Dragon Ball prototypes, the actual drafts themselves for what was to become Dragon Ball, not just doing a one-shot that would lead the way to it, but the things that he was drawing and writing that was intended to be what we would see later in 1984. I'm very excited to cover this. We've seen a lot of these designs over the years, but I feel like no one's really dove into what's available to us. And as we were working on these sections, we're like, oh my God, this is cool. Oh my God, this is cool. Oh, he said this. Oh, we're learning so many things. And I love it. I'm glad we can have this all together. So next time you hear from us, you're going to hear about Tong Pu, you're going to hear about those drafts, and we're going to have an entire new translation to go up on the site that we're pulling from, and then all the manga guide pages for all of this will be going up then. So hopefully in the next week or two, you can look forward to that. I'm very excited for that. So give us a little tease. What's on the horizon for Tong Pu?
Oh, well, there's going to be some very familiar things if you're a Dragon Ball fan. You've got alien planets and convenient storage mechanisms and even some very familiar antics within a house.
All right, so that's going to bring our episode here to a close. What was this? Episode 440? Something like that? Yeah, episode 440 of our podcast here at Kanzenshuu. Truly excited for the future of the site. We've got lots of things in the hopper. This is just one of the many things we have going on right now. I'm so excited to bring it forward. Man, www.kanzenshuu.com. That is Kanzenshuu. That is the website proper. Of course, there's all the social media. There's the forum. There's all that jazz. Find myself there. You can find Julian there. And then there's Heath and Jake as well. We are all there on the Kanzenshuus. What else do you think, man?
I think that's good.
I think that is good. So that brings it to a close. We will see you next time, whether it be for GT, whether it be for Tong Pu, or whether it be for something else entirely. It all depends on schedules and availability, as it tends to be. See you next time.